The avoidant treated you as replaceable during relationship and after relationship ended. Treated you as though your specific qualities were common enough that finding someone who provided what you provided would be straightforward. As though your understanding and patience were baseline traits most partners possess. As though your accommodation of their defended patterns was standard relationship behavior, rather than extraordinary tolerance requiring significant sacrifice of your own needs. This treatment stemmed from their defended psychology that minimized your value to protect their ego, that took for granted what you provided because acknowledging your exceptional qualities would have required acknowledging how inadequately they reciprocated, that assumed they could easily find equivalent or superior partner because inflated self-perception suggested they deserved exceptional partner without needing to provide exceptional partnership themselves. Throughout relationship, they demonstrated through their patterns that you were not special enough to motivate changing their defended behavior, not valuable enough to warrant meeting you halfway toward healthy partnership, not irreplaceable enough to justify doing therapeutic work that would develop their capacity for intimate relationship. Yet time has passed since relationship ended, and the avoidant has attempted to replace you with new partners, has tried to find someone who provides what you provided while tolerating their patterns as you tolerated them, has searched for a person who offers your specific combination of emotional intelligence and patience and understanding and accommodation. These replacement attempts have failed in ways that forced recognition they did not anticipate. No one else possesses your specific depth of understanding about their defended psychology. No one else demonstrates your level of patience with their withdrawal and inconsistency. No one else accommodates their patterns as extensively as you accommodated them. No one else provides the emotional access and regulation and mirroring you provided. No one else makes them feel as known and understood as you made them feel. No one else tolerates their defended limitations without implementing consequences or establishing boundaries that make their patterns costly rather than cost-free as your accommodation made them. The failed replacement attempts created crisis of recognition, where the avoidant faces that you were not ordinary partner who could be easily replaced, but were exceptional person, whose specific qualities and whose specific willingness to sacrifice yourself for relationship with them is statistically rare and probably unreplicatable. They took you for granted, assuming what you provided was common. They now recognize through failed attempts to find equivalent replacement that what you provided was extraordinary. They minimized your value during relationship. They now face through comparison to inadequate replacements that your value far exceeded what their defended minimization allowed them to acknowledge. They treated you as replaceable. They now understand through inability to successfully replace you that you were irreplaceable person whose loss represents permanent cost rather than temporary inconvenience they assumed could be resolved by finding new partner. This recognition that you are not ordinary creates specific crisis for avoidance defended psychology. The recognition wounds ego that depended on believing they were more valuable partner in dynamic, that their patterns were tolerable enough that adequate partners would accept them, that losing you cost them nothing they could not easily recover through finding replacement. The recognition generates regret about how they treated you. Regret that they did not value you adequately while you were available, that their patterns cost them relationship with someone they now recognize as exceptional, that they may have lost their best or only chance at relationship with person of your caliber. The recognition creates obsession with you as person they cannot replace. Obsession that keeps you present in their awareness while they cycle through inadequate replacements, that makes every new partner suffer from unfavorable comparison to you, that prevents them from genuinely moving forward because they remain stuck, processing loss of person they now recognize as extraordinary rather than ordinary partner they assumed you were. Yet the recognition that you are not ordinary does not translate into avoidant developing capacity to deserve you or capacity to sustain healthy relationship if reconnection occurred. The recognition is cognitive understanding about your value. Understanding that remains separate from therapeutic work required to address defended patterns that cost them relationship with you. They can recognize you were exceptional while remaining exactly the same defended limited person whose patterns necessitated your departure. They can obsess over losing irreplaceable person while making zero effort to become person capable of sustaining relationship with someone of your caliber. They can regret how they treated you while maintaining all the defensive structures that generated the inadequate treatment they now regret. The recognition of your extraordinary nature serves their emotional processing and their ego wound, serves as explanation for why replacement attempts fail, as validation that losing you was significant loss rather than minor setback, as focus for their regret and their obsession. Yet recognition alone does not generate the growth or change that would make them adequate partner for extraordinary person they belatedly recognized you to be. They assumed your depth was common until shallow replacements proved otherwise. The avoidant took for granted your emotional depth throughout relationship because they lacked framework for recognizing depth as exceptional quality rather than a standard trait most people possess. Your emotional intelligence allowed you to understand their defended psychology with unusual accuracy. You recognized their withdrawal as defended response to intimacy rather than as simple disinterest. You understood their patterns stemmed from attachment wounds rather than from character flaws. You perceived their emotional unavailability as limitation created by trauma rather than as intentional cruelty. This understanding required sophisticated psychological knowledge combined with genuine empathic capacity to apply that knowledge to specific individual person rather than treating them as generic category. Yet the avoidant experienced your understanding as normal baseline, assumed most emotionally intelligent people would understand them similarly, believed your depth of perception was common enough that finding replacement with equivalent understanding would be straightforward. Your emotional depth also manifested through capacity to hold space for complex, contradictory feelings without becoming overwhelmed or withdrawing. You could simultaneously recognize you were being harmed by their patterns while maintaining compassion for wounded person behind those patterns. You could feel hurt about their inadequacy while understanding their limitations stemmed from defended structure rather than from lack of caring. You could be frustrated with their withdrawal while recognizing withdrawal served protective function for their threatened psychology. This capacity to hold multiple complex feelings simultaneously without collapsing into simplistic judgment or reactive withdrawal required exceptional emotional sophistication. Yet avoidant assumed this was standard emotional functioning, believed most people could maintain nuanced understanding rather than recognizing your capacity as rare skill requiring significant emotional development most people have not achieved. The avoidant attempted to replace you with new partners, expecting those partners would demonstrate similar depth of understanding and similar capacity for emotional complexity. Yet replacement attempts revealed through painful comparison that your depth was exceptional rather than ordinary. New partners lack your intuitive understanding of defended psychology. They interpret avoidance withdrawal as disinterest or rejection rather than understanding it as defended response to intimacy. They respond to patterns with hurt or anger rather than with compassionate understanding of wounds creating patterns. New partners cannot hold emotional complexity. They experience hurt without simultaneous compassion, feel anger without simultaneous understanding, collapse into reactive judgment rather than maintaining nuanced perspective that recognizes both harm and humanity. New partners require extensive explanation of avoidance internal experience. They do not intuitively grasp what you understood without explanation, cannot read between lines of avoidance defended communication, need constant clarification where you provided understanding that felt like being truly known. The contrast between your intuitive depth and replacement's surface level understanding forces recognition that your depth was extraordinary. The avoidant must explain themselves extensively to new partners in ways they never needed to explain to you, must articulate their needs, their triggers, their defended responses in explicit detail rather than being understood through your intuitive perception. This required explanation feels exhausting and makes avoidant recognize how much easier relationship with you was despite other challenges, how much your understanding reduced their cognitive and emotional labor, how valuable your depth was in creating sense of being known. They did not appreciate until experiencing shallow replacements who cannot know them as you knew them. The recognition that your depth made them feel more understood than they have felt with anyone else creates obsessive longing for what they lost. Longing for being known in ways shallow replacements cannot provide. For ease of being with someone who understands without extensive explanation. For depth they took for granted until shallow replacements proved depth was exceptional rather than ordinary quality. Your depth particularly manifested through ability to see beneath their defended presentation to wounded authentic self they hide from most people. You perceived their defended independence as protection against vulnerability rather than as genuine preference for solitude. You recognized their emotional control as suppression of feeling rather than as natural emotional stability. You understood their patterns as adaptation to childhood wounds rather than as fixed personality traits. This seeing beneath created intimacy Avoidant simultaneously craved and feared. Craved because being truly known addresses profound loneliness defended presentation creates. Feared because being seen beneath defenses threatens defensive structure. Yet, Avoidant assumed this penetrating perception was common. Believed emotionally perceptive people generally could see beneath surface presentation, did not recognize your specific capacity to perceive defended wounds as exceptional skill, requiring both knowledge and empathic attunement most people lack. Replacement partners see only defended presentation without perceiving wounded self beneath. They accept Avoidant's independence at face value without recognizing defended quality. Interpret emotional control as stability without perceiving suppression, treat patterns as personality without understanding adaptive defensive origin. This surface-level perception means replacements relate to defended false self rather than to authentic wounded self, means Avoidant must maintain defended presentation constantly without opportunity to be seen and accepted as they actually are beneath defenses. The contrast between your depth that perceived authentic self and replacement's shallowness that sees only defended presentation forces. Recognition that your capacity to see them truly was rare gift they did not value adequately while you provided it. The recognition generates grief about loss of being known, grief that they must now maintain defended presentation without relief. Your penetrating compassionate perception provided that they lost person who saw their authentic self and accepted what you saw there. That finding another person with your depth of perception is improbable enough that they may never again experience being known as you knew them. Understanding that Avoidant assumed your depth was common until shallow replacements proved otherwise allows recognition that their newfound appreciation of your depth does not indicate they developed capacity to reciprocate depth or to deserve partner of your caliber. They recognize your depth was exceptional, yet recognition is passive acknowledgement rather than active development of their own depth. They miss being understood, yet they have not done work to understand themselves more deeply or to develop capacity to understand partners with similar depth. They grieve loss of being known, yet they maintain defended presentation that prevents being truly known by new partners rather than doing therapeutic work to integrate authentic self with conscious presentation. The recognition of your extraordinary depth serves to make them feel worse about what they lost without motivating them to become person capable of appreciating and reciprocating depth if given another chance with you or with future partner of similar caliber. They mistook your patience for weakness until boundaries elsewhere showed them strength. The Avoidant interpreted your patience throughout relationship as weakness or as unlimited resource they could exploit indefinitely without consequences. You tolerated their withdrawal repeatedly without implementing lasting consequences. They concluded you lacked strength to establish boundaries, rather than recognizing your patience reflected hope, relationship would improve, and commitment to supporting them through their struggles. You accommodated their patterns extensively, adjusting your needs downward to match their limited capacity. They interpreted accommodation as your inadequate self-worth, rather than as your generous choice to sacrifice yourself for relationship you valued. You remained invested despite inadequate reciprocation, maintaining hope and effort when their patterns would have driven most people away. They viewed continued investment as your neediness or your inability to be alone, rather than recognizing investment demonstrated loyalty and commitment to partnership they never adequately reciprocated. This interpretation of patience as weakness served defensive function for Avoidant by protecting ego from recognizing your patience was choice rather than limitation. If your patience reflected weakness, reflected that you lacked options so you tolerated their inadequacy, reflected that you needed them more than they needed you, reflected that you could not establish boundaries due to low self-worth, then Avoidant could maintain inflated self-perception where they were more valuable partner whose patterns you tolerated because you were grateful for access to them. This ego-protecting interpretation prevented facing that your patience was strength, was choice to remain committed to relationship despite their patterns, was sacrifice of your needs for someone you valued, was loyalty they did not deserve given their inadequate reciprocation. Recognizing patience as strength would have required acknowledging you were choosing to stay with inadequate partner rather than lacking options, would have meant facing they were less valuable partner whose patterns you generously tolerated, would have demanded appreciation for sacrifice you made. Rather than taking for granted your accommodation, they reinterpreted as weakness. The avoidant maintained this interpretation while you were available because your continued tolerance despite their patterns seemed to confirm weakness interpretation. If you were a strong person with options and self-worth, surely you would leave rather than continuing to tolerate treatment that consistently fell below adequate standards. Yet you left definitively, establishing boundaries that ended relationship, implementing consequences they did not believe you capable of implementing. Your departure proved your patience was not weakness, but was choice that had limits. Choice you maintained while hoping relationship would improve. Choice you withdrew when patterns demonstrated improvement was not occurring. Choice that reflected strength to stay committed through difficulties combined with strength to leave when difficulties proved intolerable. Your post-relationship behavior further demonstrated strength the avoidant had misinterpreted as weakness. You maintained boundaries after leaving, refusing to re-engage despite their breadcrumb attempts. Boundaries proved you had self-respect they assumed you lacked during relationship. You moved forward, building satisfying independent life, rather than remaining stuck, hoping for their return. Forward movement proved you had options and capacity for happiness they assumed you lacked. You demonstrated indifference to their life and their choices, rather than monitoring them obsessively. Indifference proved you had released attachment they assumed would keep you perpetually available. You thrived, visibly improving your well-being in ways that suggested relationship with them had been limiting rather than enhancing. Thriving proved you had strength they never recognized because they misinterpreted your patience as weakness rather than recognizing patience as generous choice from strong person who chose to sacrifice themselves for relationship they valued. The recognition that your patience was strength rather than weakness particularly emerged through avoidance observation, that new partners establish boundaries immediately that you took years to establish. New partners will not tolerate withdrawal patterns. They establish from beginning that extended withdrawal without communication is unacceptable, and they will leave if pattern continues. New partners will not accommodate defended limitations. They require emotional availability and consistency from start, rather than adjusting their expectations downward as you adjusted yours. New partners will not sacrifice their needs. They maintain their standards and implement consequences when standards are not met, rather than remaining patient, hoping avoidant will eventually develop capacity to meet standards. These immediate boundaries from new partners prove that your patience was exceptional choice rather than standard relationship baseline. That your accommodation was sacrifice most people will not make, rather than weakness most people demonstrate. That your tolerance was strength to remain committed rather than inability to leave. The contrast forces recognition that what they interpreted as your weakness was actually your extraordinary strength and commitment. You chose to stay through difficulties that would have driven away people with less strength or less commitment. You chose to sacrifice yourself, believing relationship was worth sacrifice and hoping sacrifice would eventually generate improvement. You chose loyalty to person and to relationship when most people would have chosen self-protection. This recognition wounds ego that depended on believing you tolerated their patterns because you were a weak partner, grateful for access to valuable them. Recognition proves instead you were a strong partner who chose to sacrifice yourself for someone who did not deserve sacrifice, who could have left at any point but chose to stay committed, who tolerated inadequacy not because you lacked options, but because you valued relationship and believed in person beneath defended patterns. The recognition also generates regret that avoidant tested your patience and strength through their patterns until patience reached its limits. They assumed patience was unlimited or reflected weakness that meant consequences would never come. This assumption led to continued inadequate behavior, confident you would continue tolerating regardless of how poorly they treated you. Your definitive departure proved patience had limits that their patterns exceeded. Proved strength you demonstrated through staying would also be demonstrated through leaving. proved they miscalculated by treating your patient loyalty as weakness they could exploit rather than as gift they should have valued. The regret about testing strength until it manifested as boundary that ended relationship combines with recognition. They lost person whose patience reflected exceptional strength and commitment they never adequately appreciated or reciprocated. Understanding that avoidant mistook patience for weakness until boundaries elsewhere showed strength allows recognition that newfound appreciation of your strength does not indicate they developed capacity to value strength appropriately or to reciprocate commitment strength represented. They recognize you were strong, yet they maintain patterns that would continue testing strength and patience if reconnection occurred, would continue exploiting generosity until limits are reached, would continue taking for granted what you provide until providing it becomes intolerable. They regret miscalculating your strength, yet they have not done therapeutic work to address patterns that made them treat strength as weakness to exploit, that made them take for granted loyalty and commitment they should have treasured, that made them continue inadequate behavior confident. You lacked strength to establish consequences their patterns deserved. Recognition of your strength serves to wound their ego and generate regret about loss, yet does not translate into their becoming person who would value and reciprocate strength if given another opportunity with you or with future partner who demonstrates similar patient committed strength. They measured your worth by what you tolerated, not by what you offered. The avoidant assessed your value throughout relationship using fundamentally flawed measurement system that evaluated you based on what treatment you would tolerate rather than based on what exceptional qualities and contributions you offered to relationship. They measured worth through your tolerance of their withdrawal. If you continued pursuing despite withdrawal, this tolerance proved you were adequately invested and therefore adequate partner. They measured worth through your accommodation of their patterns. If you adjusted expectations downward, accepting their defended limitations, this accommodation proved you were understanding and therefore acceptable partner. They measured worth through your sacrifice of your needs. If you remained in relationship despite inadequate reciprocation, this sacrifice proved you valued them adequately and therefore deserved their minimal effort. This measurement system inherently devalued you because it defined your worth by capacity to endure inadequate treatment, rather than defining worth by your inherent qualities, your contributions to relationship, your exceptional capacities that made you valuable independent of how much inadequacy you would tolerate. The flawed measurement served defensive function by protecting avoidant from facing their own inadequacy and from recognizing obligation to reciprocate what you provided. If your worth was measured by tolerance of inadequacy, then providing increasing inadequacy actually increased your value in their measurement system. The more you tolerated, the more valuable you appeared because tolerance proved your investment and commitment. This perverse logic meant avoidant felt no obligation to improve their behavior to deserve you. Your willingness to tolerate behavior actually confirmed your value in system where value equals tolerance. Recognizing your worth should be measured by what you offered rather than by what you tolerated would have required acknowledging you provided exceptional understanding, emotional depth, patient support, loyal commitment, while they provided minimal reciprocation, would have demanded facing they were inadequate partner who did not deserve what you offered, would have created obligation to reciprocate, or to do work developing capacity to reciprocate. The avoidant maintained this flawed measurement while you were available because your continued tolerance seemed to confirm measurement system was appropriate. Yet after you left, after their attempts to find replacement partners, the flawed measurement revealed itself as profoundly inadequate way to assess worth. New partners will not tolerate what you tolerated. In avoidance measurement system, this should mean new partners are less valuable than you were. Yet new partners offer other qualities that make them valuable. They have healthy boundaries that create more functional dynamic. They require reciprocity that motivates avoidant to provide more effort. They establish consequences that make patterns costly, forcing avoidant to examine whether patterns serve them. These qualities make new partners valuable despite, or because of, their intolerance of inadequate treatment. Proving worth cannot be measured solely by tolerance of inadequacy. Simultaneously, avoidant recognizes through failed replacement attempts that what you offered beyond your tolerance was exceptional and irreplaceable. You offered emotional intelligence that understood their defended psychology. You offered depth that perceived their authentic wounded self beneath defended presentation. You offered patience that reflected strength and commitment rather than weakness. You offered accommodation that was generous sacrifice rather than indication of low self-worth. You offered understanding that made them feel truly known in ways shallow replacements cannot replicate. You offered loyal, consistent investment despite inadequate reciprocation. Each of these offerings represented exceptional value independent of your tolerance, represented qualities that made you an extraordinary partner whose worth far exceeded what their flawed measurement system assigned you. The recognition that they measured worth by tolerance rather than by offerings creates crisis where avoidant faces. They fundamentally misunderstood your value while you were available. They assumed you were adequately valuable based on your tolerance. They now recognize you were exceptionally valuable based on what you offered independent of tolerance. They believed finding someone who would tolerate their patterns similarly would mean finding an equivalent partner. They now understand tolerance was only a small part of what made you valuable, that your exceptional offerings beyond tolerance are what made you irreplaceable. They took for granted what you provided, focusing only on whether you would continue tolerating. They now recognize what you provided was an extraordinary gift they never adequately appreciated because flawed measurement system prevented recognizing value of gifts you offered. The recognition particularly wounds when avoidant realizes that by measuring worth through tolerance, they actively devalued you and themselves. By treating your tolerance as measure of value, they incentivized you to tolerate increasing inadequacy to prove your worth. Dynamic that harmed you by requiring continued sacrifice and harmed them by preventing facing consequences that would have motivated growth. By failing to measure worth through your offerings, they failed to appreciate exceptional partner whose qualities far exceeded what they deserved. Failure that cost them relationship with someone they now recognize as irreplaceable. By using fundamentally flawed measurement system, they created dynamic where they continued inadequate behavior, confident you would continue tolerating, missing opportunity to value and reciprocate what you offered until offerings were withdrawn through your departure. Understanding that avoidant measured worth by what you tolerated rather than by what you offered allows recognition that newfound appreciation of your exceptional offerings does not indicate they have developed better measurement system or capacity to value future partners appropriately. They recognize you offered exceptional qualities, yet they have not examined the flawed measurement system that prevented appreciating those qualities while you were available. They understand your worth exceeded what tolerance-based measurement assigned, yet they maintain psychological patterns that would recreate similar flawed measurement in future relationships, would focus on what partner tolerates rather than valuing what partner offers. They regret not appreciating your offerings, yet they have not done therapeutic work to develop capacity to recognize and value offerings independent of tolerance, to measure partner worth by inherent qualities rather than by willingness to endure inadequate treatment. Recognition that you are exceptional serves to generate regret and obsession with what they lost, yet does not translate into their developing measurement system that would allow them to value appropriately and reciprocate adequately. If given another chance with you or with future partner who offers similar exceptional qualities. They failed to measure accurately when they measured worth solely by tolerance, rather than by the extraordinary offerings that made you irreplaceable partner whose loss represents permanent cost of their fundamentally flawed approach to assessing value in relationships.